This sugar and spice isn't everything nice. This is Sega Masters. We're still in September of 1986, looking at the first wave of North American releases for the Sega Master System, and thus far we've mainly covered the offerings released on the lower-priced Sega cards, which have been less than impressive to say the least. Fortunately, the Master System's early US library didn't consist entirely of card titles coming off as early 1980s low-budget computer games, with simple gameplay and very little substance or depth to keep gamers interested long-term. When Sega was originally crafting software for the 8-bit console the previous year in Japan, they quickly realized they could only go so far with the limiting card format, if they wanted to stand a chance against Nintendo. Thus, titles for the Mark III began appearing on higher capacity cartridges, which allowed for more top-tier experiences on par with the competition. Most of these cards even made their way across the Pacific Ocean in one form or another as part of the first wave of North American releases for Sega's console. The first of these so-called mega cartridges we'll be looking at is Fantasy Zone, a home conversion of Sega's quirky arcade shooter, which is also the first entry in one of several franchises that Sega supported throughout the 1980s, but ended up forgetting about the following decade. Now, the Fantasy Zone in question is a faraway solar system of colorful, psychedelic planets which are being invaded and attacked by the malevolent Menin Empire. One hero has taken it upon himself to beat back the invaders single-handedly, and he's known as Opa-Opa, a winged, egg-shaped sentient starfighter who briefly served as something of a mascot for Sega during its early console days in Japan. Fantasy Zone was originally a 1986 arcade game that was designed by Yuji Ishii, who also created Flicky and Teddy Boy Blues. It was most likely inspired by the success of other famous horizontal shooters such as Williams' Defender or Konami's Gradius. While it more or less followed the template of those aforementioned titles, Fantasy Zone also added in a few unique touches to the formula to help it stand out from the other shooters flooding the coin-op market in the early to mid-1980s. Most notably, instead of the standard sci-fi setting as in other shooters, the action took place in a unique game world with bright, surreal pastel stages and enemies. One of the first of the so-called cute-em-ups, if you will. With its smooth gameplay and a jamming soundtrack to go with it, Fantasy Zone ended up becoming a massive hit for Sega in Japan, as well as something of a cult favorite elsewhere in the world. So it's no surprise that Sega would want a conversion of Fantasy Zone for their home system to serve as the marquee title that could hopefully attract consumers to their platform, and made it one of the first cartridge releases for their console. Even though the coin-op wasn't as successful or beloved outside of Japan, Sega still decided to include Fantasy Zone among the first wave of titles for the Master System's US and European launches. While Fantasy Zone seems very much like Defender or most other horizontal shooters on the surface, it doesn't take long to see what makes this card so unique. Each of the 8 colorful stages Opa-Opa is out to liberate freely score horizontally to the left or the right and eventually wrap around. As you're blasting the hostile creatures constantly flying after you with your twin guns and bombs, each defeated foe drops money you can scoop up. Every so often a shop icon will appear, allowing you to access the parts shop offering upgrades for you to purchase with the cash you manage to collect from defeated baddies. Among the choices are stronger one-time use bombs, wings and engines for better speed and mobility, more powerful special weapons such as lasers and spread shots, and even extra lives. Once you exit the shop, you get to choose which of your upgrades to equip before unleashing your new abilities on your foes. The special weapons in particular are impressive, but sadly come with timers which start ticking down the moment you leave this screen. Thus you don't get very long to enjoy your more potent offense and need to do as much damage as you can while it's at your disposal. Your main objective in each stage is to dispatch the 6 enemy-generating bases scattered around the landscape, each of which take a number of hits before going down. Once the last generator is knocked down, the boss of the level himself will eventually appear to confront you, and you obviously need to defeat them to continue your crusade, dodging the projectiles being shot at you while returning fire, hopefully striking their weak spot. You can't take too long to defeat these behemoths either. After a certain amount of time the boss will actually attempt to ram into you and they are very difficult to avoid. Land enough hits and the boss explodes into a big pile of cash you can scoop up while the victory theme is playing. Then it's off to the next planet to repeat the process. There are 8 levels altogether, though the last stage forces you to survive a gauntlet of all the previous bosses before you meet the final challenge, which will allow Opa-Opa to discover the true mastermind behind the Menin invasion. This Master System conversion is an admirable attempt to bring Fantasy Zone to the console realm, and much of the coin-op did make the transition intact, including the charming, addictive shooting action. Though it's not surprising that a few significant compromises with the presentation and gameplay were necessary, even with the extra memory allotted by the Mega cartridge format. As expected, the graphics are a slight downgrade compared to the arcade original, but are still bright and colorful, with some well-drawn backgrounds, and the characters all sport some cute details and animation. However, the vertical scrolling from the coin-op was eliminated for this home version, so the action takes place on a single horizontal strip that can feel a little cramped at times, but isn't too bad. The radar from the coin-op indicating the location of the bases was omitted as well, so you often have to scour the level to make sure you get them all. Much like the visuals, the background themes don't compare well to the jamming tunes of the coin-op, but are still pretty catchy and work for each setting, while the sound effects are nothing special. Most of the bosses from the arcade version are present and impressively drawn and detailed as well, though two of the titans from the original coin-op apparently couldn't be replicated on this console, so they were replaced with a pair of bosses exclusive to this version. Also, these confrontations take place against a single colored background, something we'll see pop up again more than once throughout the Master System's lifetime. Of course, the irony about Fantasy Zone is, despite its bright and cheerful presentation, the difficulty is actually quite harsh, with a few quirks that can make it an exercise in frustration, especially since just one touch from either a projectile or foe is enough to cause Opa-Opa to perish. The first couple levels aren't too taxing, but it isn't long before you're constantly under duress from bullets and baddies flying from every direction, requiring some lightning-quick reactions to survive. The constantly shifting free-scrolling can also contribute to the cruelty, particularly when you quickly change direction as the screen often struggles to keep up. You can often find yourself flying head-on into an enemy that was previously out of view and suffer some cheap deaths as a result. Nonetheless, this grab can be overcome with a bit of practice and patience, and the simple, responsive controls do enable you to make some fast movements to increase your odds of survival. Being able to soup Opa-Opa up with upgrades does add a unique touch to the shooter formula, though its actual usefulness is hampered by the rather short timers on the super weapons. With the shop usually appearing fairly early in the level, you'll most likely burn through your weapons pretty quickly, often forcing you to finish the level and fight the boss with just your normal guns. You can, however, stretch out your powered up time by purchasing multiple super guns, choosing one to immediately equip, and once that runs out, the rare select icon might appear, allowing you to go back to the parts select screen to activate your other armaments. Just beware that should you perish, you lose all your upgrades, even the ones you haven't equipped yet, which is quite unfair. Even with its faults and the extreme difficulty, Fantasy Zone still manages to provide well-done addictive shooting action that just may hook you with its quirky charm and keep you playing for a short time. At the same time, however, it is but one of many arcade ports on the Master System that may have seemed adequate for their time, yet have admittedly been rendered somewhat outdated by the conversions that have come along since on later, more advanced consoles. More accurate depictions of Fantasy Zone in particular can be found on the TurboGrafx-16 and Saturn, consoles with the horsepower to produce renditions that come closer to the arcade game than Sega's version for its 8-bit platform. Then again, why even bother with outdated home conversions at all nowadays, when emulations of the coin-op are so easily accessible on certain recent compilations and platforms, giving fans of the arcade game opportunities to relive the original version in all its glory on their home televisions without any console compromises. If that wasn't enough, the Master System exclusive sequel released a year later, which we will look at in due time, does address most of this title's flaws, making it even harder to give it any strong recommendation. Nonetheless, taking on its own merits, Fantasy Zone is still a solid cartridge for what it is despite its age. If you're just looking for a good, fun, different type of shooter to fire up on the console and can put up with a lot of frustrating deaths, this cart will fill that need nicely.